What is anthropology? I'm Dr. Katie Nelson, and I'll be guiding you through this lecture. Slide 1. This is a lecture on the fundamental elements of the discipline of anthropology and its 4 subfields or 4 subdisciplines. Slide 2. Lecture objectives. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to 1. Define anthropology, 2. Identify and describe the 4 subdisciplines of anthropology, and 3. Describe how anthropology is different from and similar to other social science disciplines. Slide 3. So what is anthropology? The word anthropology comes from the Greek anthropos and logia, which means essentially the study of humans. So it is, in fact, the study of humankind. And it ranges from humanity's very beginnings millions of years ago to the present day. So anthropology seeks to understand the full spectrum and complexity of cultures across all of human history. It's a very broad discipline. Okay, slide 4. At its most fundamental level, anthropology can be defined as the study of what makes us human. And again, it's a very broad discipline. So it studies human nature as well as human societies, human cultures, as well as human cultural diversity, human biology, our human past and ancestors, as well as our primate cousins, our non-human primate cousins. Slide 5. General anthropology, at least how is practiced in the United States today, has 4 subdisciplines. And these are cultural anthropology, biological or physical anthropology. You can use either term. They're interchangeable. Archaeological anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. And we're going to talk about each of these subdisciplines in more detail later on in the lecture. Slide 6. So essentially there are 3 primary dimensions of anthropology. And these are that, number 1, anthropology is a very holistic discipline. Holistic. And this means that anthropology addresses essentially anything and everything that makes us humans. So this can be our biology, our culture, our social and cultural structures and institutions. It can include our evolutionary past, our evolutionary history, and so on. And so it's a very holistic discipline. Anthropology is also a very comparative discipline, and that means that anthropologists across the disciplines, the subdisciplines, are constantly comparing and contrasting between different things. For instance, if among cultural anthropologists, they might be looking at different cultural institutions and comparing and contrasting between different cultures. Or they might look at the institution of kinship or family and look at how different societies construct and relate to family and kinship around the world. Anthropology is also a very scientific and humanistic discipline. So we have this saying in anthropology that anthropology is the most scientific of the humanities and the most humanistic of the sciences. Nevertheless, it is considered to be a social science in academia today. So essentially, the sciences, by scientific we're referring to the hard science disciplines. So it's scientific in the same way that like biology or chemistry or other hard sciences are scientific. But anthropology is also humanistic in the same way that other humanities are. And an example of a humanity discipline would be the arts, or philosophy or language, those sorts of appreciative disciplines. So anthropology really kind of bridges the gap between both science and humanity. it's an interesting discipline in that sense. Okay, slide 7. So, again, general anthropology, as we mentioned before, developed as a scientific field in the United States, and began developing as a scientific discipline in the early 1900s. And early North American anthropologists were interested in studying, especially studying many Native American people and native peoples of North America. And they were interested in conducting these kind of comprehensive studies. So they would study the customs of these indigenous tribes. They would study their social life, their languages, as well as their physical traits. And all of these kind of holistic dimensions of what it is to be human slowly developed into this 4-field specialization within anthropology as it's practiced today. Slide 8. So general anthropology in the United States, or it's also known as the academic discipline of anthropology, or otherwise known as 4-field anthropology, includes these 4 subdisciplines. And again, they are cultural anthropology, and sometimes it's also referred to as sociocultural anthropology, archaeological anthropology, also sometimes known as just archaeology, biological anthropology, which is also sometimes referred to as physical anthropology, and finally linguistic anthropology. And I wanted to point out here, if you're following this lecture with the slides, that there's an image of President Barack Obama on the lower right-hand corner here of slide 8. And you'll notice that in this image of him as a child, he's with his mother, who was actually a cultural anthropologist named Ann Dunham. And she's done some really interesting work as well within cultural anthropology. Okay, so slide 9. So the 4 subdisciplines of anthropology, again, are cultural anthropology, which studies the people and social organization of cultures that are living today. Archaeology studies the material remains of different cultural groups. So essentially, archaeology has a lot in common with cultural anthropology in its topics of study. The only difference is that archaeologists are looking at cultures and culture groups that are no longer alive today. Linguistic anthropology is interested in languages and communication among cultural groups. And finally, biological or physical anthropology looks at human biology and human biological variation, as well as our human origins and our and other primates as well. Slide 10. So these 4 subdisciplines explore variations in time, across time and space. And it's important to note that just because we refer to them as 4 separate subdisciplines, they're not self-contained disciplines, but they very much influence each other. So, for instance, there is a belief, there's a theory by this, it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that states that the way that that the language that we speak can affect the way that we think about the world. So our language can possibly affect the way that perhaps we're able to think about things and the way that we culturally frame different things. And so each of these subdisciplines very much influence each other. And we really can't be looking at each of these subdisciplines as if they were entirely separate. And that's because essentially you can't make sound conclusions about human nature from just studying a single nation or a single society or just one cultural aspect. But you have to be looking at all these dimensions of what makes us human in order to truly understand human nature. Okay, slide 11. Now we're going to look at the four different subdisciplines of anthropology in more detail, starting with cultural anthropology. So as I mentioned before, cultural anthropology is looking at people and cultural groups that are alive today. And cultural anthropologists describe, analyze, interpret, and explain social and cultural similarities and differences across these different groups around the world. And there's two sorts of ways that cultural anthropologists do their work. The first one is ethnography. And this is a very important term that you understand. Ethnography. Ethnography is fieldwork in a particular culture, and ethnography produces exceptionally detailed and deep account of a particular community, society, or culture. Right? Ethnology, on the other hand, is a more comparative study, cross-cultural study of ethnographic data, society, and culture. So what essentially ethnologists will do is they might gather the ethnographic stories of various different anthropologists, and then they might combine them together and compare and contrast between them to come up with some sort of larger theory that makes sense of all of these different ethnographic accounts. Ethnography requires fieldwork to collect data. Fieldwork is an intensive period that anthropologists spend in the field interacting one-on-one with people and living among them. Ethnography often produces very descriptive data, and it's oftentimes specific to one or two very particular groups or communities. Ethnology, on the other hand, uses the data collected by a series of researchers, and it's usually synthetic. That means that it synthesizes or brings together all of these different data. Ethnology also tends to be comparative and cross-cultural, whereas, for example, ethnography is specific to a particular group. And if you're following along on the lecture slides, you'll see an image in the bottom right-hand corner, and that's of me conducting research, ethnographic research, for my PhD dissertation, which was on identity formation among undocumented Mexican immigrant students and college students in Minnesota. So here I'm conducting an ethnographic interview. Okay, slide 12, archaeology. So archaeology, again, shares a lot in common with cultural anthropology and the types of topics that it's interested in studying. The main difference, however, is that with archaeology, they're studying cultural groups that are no longer alive. And so in order to be able to study groups that are no longer alive, you can't, for example, go out and talk to people or ask them questions or observe their behavior. Instead, you have to rely on things that they've left behind. And those things that they've left behind are called artifacts. Artifacts can be anything. They could be pot shards, they could be jewelry, they could be tools, they could be the remains of structures or human burials, etc. But oftentimes, what people leave behind is simply just garbage. And garbage can be enormously revealing. And I think you'll see here, if you're following along in the lecture slides, that there's an image of two archaeologists examining some contemporary garbage. And there's been this is called garbology, and there's actually been a number of different contemporary archaeologists, that have looked at what it is that people say that they throw away and what it is that they actually throw away. And what they've found is that, in fact, it's there's a big gap between what people believe or people say that they throw away and discard and what they in fact really do throw away and discard. And that can be very revealing to archaeologists. There's also ancient garbage sites, and so sometimes the remains of foods and all kinds of different sorts of kind of ancient garbage can be found at different sites as well. Slide 13. So biological anthropology or physical anthropology is the study of biological variation, of human biological variation across space and across time. And biological anthropology is interested in human evolution, in human genetics, human growth and development, human biological plasticity, as well as the biology, evolution, behavior, and social life of monkeys, apes, and other non-human primates. And the one distinction that you can make between biological anthropology and cultural anthropology is that biological anthropology is mostly interested in non-cultural elements of what it is to be human. Okay, slide 14, linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology is the study of language in its social and cultural context across space and time. And historical linguists oftentimes will reconstruct ancient languages, and they may study linguistic variation through time. Sociolinguistics is a type of research that investigates the relationship between social and linguistic variation. And slide 15, anthropology and other disciplines. So really one of the features that distinguishes anthropology from other social sciences is anthropology's broad scope, or in other words, its holistic nature. So again, anthropology is unique in that it's both humanistic and scientific. Another thing that distinguishes anthropology is its cross-cultural comparison. So again, it's a comparative discipline, and anthropologists are constantly interested in comparing and contrasting between different cultural groups. Traditionally, sociologists, and sociology is possibly one of the closest fields, especially when it comes to cultural anthropology. And traditionally, sociologists focused on the industrial West, on complex, highly technological societies such as the United States, whereas anthropologists tended to traditionally study in non-industrial societies with low technologies. This, of course, is changing today, and more anthropologists are studying and conducting studies in large-scale technologically advanced societies like the United States. And some sociologists are even interested in going beyond and looking at different cultural groups as well. But cultural anthropology differs from other social sciences in its focus on the local. And this is also oftentimes can be the poor or the powerless within a community. And these are the local people, the average people, rather than, for example, the policy makers or the decision makers or the elites, etc. So cultural anthropology is most interested in looking at how ordinary people live their lives.